This week I was reading about a young missionary couple who in 1921 left Sweden for the interior of Africa, and they would soon be joined by another missionary couple, and together they decided to bring the good news to a particular remote village in Africa. When they arrived, however, the chief rejected them and would not let them enter his village for fear of displeasing the local gods. And the two couples had no choice but to go up on a hillside on a slope of land and build their own mud huts. They prayed for a spiritual breakthrough, but none came. Their only contact was a young boy who was allowed to sell them chicken and eggs twice a week. Sophia Flood, David's wife, decided that if this was the only villager she would be allowed to talk to, she would take advantage of it and teach him the gospel of Jesus Christ. Soon after, this young African boy accepted Christ and the free gift of salvation. Beyond that little boy, there were no other advancements made into that village. In the meantime, malaria began to strike this small missionary team. The other couple finally decided that they had enough. They left David and Sophia Flood alone on that hillside in their mud hut. In the midst of these trying times, Sophia became pregnant, and only then did the village chief soften his hard stance against them, and he allowed a midwife from the village to help her as her little girl was going to be born. And it was all too much of a strain for this young missionary woman. She was weak from her delivery, along with her battle with malaria, that 17 days after giving birth, she died. And something caved in on her husband in that moment. For the first time, he experienced in Africa a life-altering disappointment. David Flood dug a crude grave, buried his 27-year-old wife, took the child down the mountain to a mission station where he handed the missionary couple his daughter and said, "I'm going back to Sweden. I've lost my wife. I can't take care of this baby. God is not good. He has ruined my life." And with that, he turned his back on his daughter, his ministry. He turned his back on God himself. He could not make sense of his story. When I read that this week, I could not help but to think that some of you have been damaged by a disappointment in such a way that you don't know how you could ever again believe in the idea of a good God who has unwavering intentions for good in your life. I refuse to put up a facade that I always understand what God is doing, because I don't. Like I've told you many times, we don't live in Barbie Fairytopia. Sometimes we hurt, we bleed, we have disappointments. Sometimes we have questions. We say, "God, I don't understand why you allowed this to happen to me. God, if you're really good, I don't see how my life could look like this. God, I always wondered why you took that away from me." You see, here's the penetrating thing. You're not the only one to ask those questions. We have a young married couple in the text asking those same questions. But before we arrive at their questions, we have for us a first century love story. So here's what I want to do. I want to walk through this first century love story, and then I want to give you 6 applications. All right? It's going to be that simple. We find the love story beginning in verse 5. We're introduced to a guy named Zechariah. He grew up in the home of a priest. He wanted to be a certain girl's prince. It all started back in 4th grade when he watched Elizabeth walk down the hallway with her pink dress and matching bow. He chased her around the playground, across the monkey bars and the merry-go-round. Years later, he would see her walking down another aisle, this time in a white dress and a matching veil. And even though their wedding was arranged, Elizabeth was the one Zechariah would have chosen for himself. He adored her. And you could see it in the way that he looked at her and smiled. They were a perfect match. She was also of a priestly line, since she was of the daughters of Aaron. It was very common for a Jewish man to marry a wife of the same background. And for those first few years, life was just full of new joys. They spent all of their time together. They even began praying that God would give them a baby. Elizabeth got up one morning feeling a little dizzy and nauseous and thought, this is it. I'm expecting. They decorated the little nursery. They bought a bassinet. They started going through baby names. But then a couple of weeks later, they came to realize that it was a false hope. Months later, she told Zechariah, I'm craving pickles and peanut butter. That is not normal. This is it. I've got to be pregnant. Time would just reveal another heartbreak. This happened year after year. They continually cycled through hope and disappointment. Maybe there were even a couple of miscarriages involved. Zechariah would wake up at night with his wife crying. He would rub his eyes, push himself up into bed. What's wrong, Elizabeth? She'd say, I saw Lydia at the market today. She's been married for 4 years. She has 2 kids. We've been married for 6 years. I want a baby. Why isn't God giving us a baby? Our life isn't making sense. He did his best to comfort her. She lived in a constant fog. Everything was affected by her disappointments. And after years, and I'm talking years, after 10 years, after 20 years, after 30 years, they eventually resolved themselves to the fact that they were never going to have children. So they sat in this kind of permanent disappointment, but trusted in the unseen hand of God. In verse 6, the text says they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly. Now, what does that mean, they were both righteous? Well, that means their sins were covered. It must. The only way God can declare someone as righteous is if he didn't impute their sins to them. So as Zechariah started his priestly duty, his job, he spent his entire career chest deep in the blood of the sacrificial system, over and over and over, day after day after day, all through the years, just slaughtering animals. And never did it take away sin. The people had to come back and make another one, and another one, and another one, all their life long. And he'd say things like this, Elizabeth, God's going to send a Messiah who will die for our sins, who will face the holy justice of God. And when he comes, I'm going to be out of a job because he's going to do away with the sacrificial system. You see, for our salvation, we look back at Christ's work on the cross. But for their salvation, they looked forward to Christ's work on the cross. The text not only says they were righteous, but says they walked blamelessly. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean they were sinless. It doesn't mean they didn't have questions. It doesn't mean they were perfect. It just means they were repentant. Zechariah and Elizabeth lived such a sterling life that no one at any time could ever accuse them of not following God. Except for one thing. Verse 7. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren. Barren is a desert word. Dry, cracked, lifeless. I like to connect words in my Bible sometimes and draw a line. And you may want to do this. Connect a word in verse 6 with a word in verse 7 and draw a line. The word righteous and barren. You see, that was an incomprehensible paradox in this day because there was an Old Testament stigma and superstition related to barrenness, and society began to judge this young couple. Oh yeah, Zechariah and Elizabeth. I wonder what's wrong with them. I wonder why God is displeased with them. What don't we know about them? I mean, it really sounds like a Deuteronomy 28 case to me. God shut up the womb because of sin. That verse also said, now this couple is advanced in years. It's been at least 60 years since he chased her around the playground, maybe even 70. And he's still working because there were no retirement for priests. There was retirements for Levites in Numbers chapter 8, but there were no retirements for priests. So he's in his 70s and he's still working. And then in verse 8, now while he was serving as priest before God when his division was on duty. Let's stop there. There was only one temple, but there were thousands of priests. In fact, most scholars say there were about 18,000 priests. And because there were so many priests, they couldn't all serve in the temple at the same time, so they had to be divided down. So there were 24 divisions, and they would call up each division about twice a year. So you would only work in the temple 2 weeks a year. After that week of service, you would go back to your home, and you would do whatever you did to make your living. But on this day, Zechariah's division, verse 1, Abijah, is called up. And there were probably 50 to 60 priests serving in the temple every day. And they would know the job that they were going to do on the basis of casting lots. That's like the modern day equivalent of drawing straws. Only one could burn the incense. But there were 18,000 priests who wanted to burn the incense. We know from history that once a man burnt the incense one time, he would never be able to do it again. It was very prestigious. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. So here is Zechariah, just a common, ordinary, garden-variety, vanilla priest out of some small village. And he tells Elizabeth, it's my division's time to go up. They hug, kiss. Zechariah saddles his donkey and he leaves. And in verse 9, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. I mean, what a privilege. This is a big day for Zechariah, the best day of his life. And he looks at that temple, the massive white structure with gold-plated doors, and he walks with a few other men into the temple. One of the priests cleaned the altar of incense. Another one straightened the loaves of showbread. Another one trimmed the wicks on the candlestand. And then those 3 priests slowly retired back outside when their work was completed. And Zechariah alone was left. When one of the priests left, a unique sound was sent out. Possibly one of the priests struck a gong at the door. And upon that sound, the entire body of perhaps 50 to 60 priests fell on their faces on the ground. All the people who came to worship laid out on the ground. Everyone in the city paused. No one was selling anything. They were not talking. Silence pervaded the city. And Zechariah's heart is beating wildly. His aged hands were trembling with awe and excitement as he sprinkled the incense on the burning coals of the altar. The ascending aromatic cloud was symbolic of the prayers of the people. Symbolic for the prayers of salvation, for the prayers of the coming Messiah. Everyone watched as the smoke clouds of incense ascended. Shortly, the city would smell like Bed Bath & Beyond. And as the perfume smoke clears away, Zechariah finds himself looking into the face of an angel. Verse 12, and Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. Then this made me ask a question. How do people react when angels appear? Did you know that 32% of Americans say they have experienced an angel? And the common picture of angel sightings are pretty tame. They're pretty warm and fuzzy. It's like I saw this little baby angel wearing a diaper, looking like a Michelin baby. Then he came and ran to me and I lifted him up and I just snuggled him. Like that's what it sounds like. People have told accounts how angels have helped them find a parking space. Now that would have to be the worst job ever if you were an angel, right? You're on parking duty. You go to the Packers game. That's right. Help him find, and he's like, why can't I go to the Detroit Lions game? Nobody goes to their games. Don't have problems. You're welcome, Jack. Well, one lady in the article claims that an angel helped her make a chicken casserole. Another lady claimed that an angel helped her lose weight. She even wrote a book about it entitled The Angel's Little Diet Book. And when I read accounts like this, I don't believe them, especially after reading texts like this. Because when people saw angels, they covered their eyes, they hid their faces, they feared for their lives. Exodus 15, Judges 6, 2 Samuel 6, Isaiah 6, Daniel 8, Daniel 10. When someone sees an angel, the first thing the angel says is usually, no, it's okay. Don't die. It's usually not, I think you could use some more salt in the casserole. It's usually not what it is. So you need to realize that God had not spoken to anyone for 400 years. Not through an angel, not through a prophet, not through a priest. They're actually called the 400 silent years, and they're about to be broken. J-Mac says that there hasn't been a miracle in 800 years. The last angel appearance was to Zechariah 500 years before. And now this angel drops down named Gabriel. But this isn't the only time Gabriel has made an appearance to people. He appeared hundreds of years earlier to Daniel the prophet. And I love little scenes like this because it shows you what angels are really like. Daniel described Gabriel as wearing a linen robe having a belt of pure gold wrapped around his waist. Gabriel's face had the appearance of lightning, no doubt so bright that Daniel and Zechariah both would have shielded their eyes looking at him. The eyes of Gabriel, also described by Daniel, were glowing red, as if they were on fire. The angel's arms and feet looked like polished bronze, and his voice was described as a long, low rumble. No wonder Daniel fell to the ground in Daniel chapter 8, and Zechariah is gripped with fear here. Verse 13, the angel said to Zechariah, "Do not be afraid, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." Now, your prayer, what prayer? What is he praying? Is it the current prayer? Because he's in there interceding for the people that are outside. He's not talking about his current prayer. The thought here is the prayer that was prayed a long time ago has been heard. The Greek implies that it's a long-standing petition. It does not necessarily mean that he was praying it at that day, at that moment. In fact, I think they probably stopped praying it 20 years ago. But hear me. God records prayers in a book. The angel says, "I want you to pull out those baby blue cigars. Pull out those baby blue balloons. You're going to have a boy. His name is going to be John." And then the angel goes on to quote almost verbatim the last words of Malachi regarding John coming in the spirit and the power of Elijah to prepare people for the coming of Jesus. Then notice Zechariah's response in verse 18 to the angel. "How shall I know this? For I'm an old man," notice this, "and my wife is advanced in years." Now it sounds like he's using tact there, doesn't it? I'm old. My wife, she's just advanced in years. I know better than to call her old. They had a long and happy marriage. But actually, the Greek is different. It wasn't so tactful. Advanced in years is a much stronger word than old in the Greek. It's like Zechariah, I'm just going to call him Zach. It's like Zach is saying, "I'm old, but my wife is really old. Her birth certificate says expired. She sneezes, dust comes out. If you told her to act her age, she'd just die." I stumbled across a Navajo translation of this phrase, which isn't so nice, but pretty funny. "I am old. Her days are just about up." I like that. It's straight and to the point. Zechariah tells Gabriel, "This isn't possible. She's not fertile myrtle anymore. My geriatric wife isn't going to have a baby. She's past childbearing capacity. Gabriel, I don't believe you, and if you want me to believe you, you better give me a sign. Now get this. Zechariah is in the holy place, and suddenly, for the first time in 500 years, an angel is not only sighted, he's standing in the holy place with face like lightning and eyes like burning coals. And Zechariah says, I need a sign. Here's your sign, friend. This is it. Now let me apply this. He's saying, I need something more than the promise of God. Your word is not enough for me in my disappointment. In verse 19, the angel answered him, I am Gabriel. I stand, and see, you really can't see this. He's doing a play on words. So Zechariah says, I am old, and then the play on words, so you can't see it in English, but you can see it in Greek. I am Gabriel. So he does this. He goes, it's like a cadence to what he's saying. The complaint and then the answer. I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. Notice those last two words, good news. Good news is the same word as gospel. It's euangelion. And he's saying, Zach, you're telling me you don't believe it? You're telling me you don't believe the gospel? He wants more proof than the word from God. More proof than a promise. And in that way, this righteous man walks by sight and not by faith. This story teaches you that you can be a righteous person in the holiest of places, carrying out the holiest of acts of worship, and not believe God. Unbelief is sneaky. It slithers into your life. It's possible to doubt God while serving God. Just because you live by faith in your 20s does not mean you will live by faith in your 70s. In fact, that's a lot of the time that people settle in. They no longer go further with Christ. Gabriel judges Zach's unbelief in verse 20. He says, and behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words. God can give you the silent treatment when he wants to. That's his right, because he is God. Ligon Duncan said of Zach, he was scared stiff by an angel, struck dumb by unbelief. God says, my will doesn't depend on your belief. I'm going to push you to the side and get my will done. This is what I call the first massive timeout in the Bible. The angel's like, go to your room. No TV, no cell phones. I just want you to think about what you've done. And for 9 months, Zach could not hear or speak. Now, where did that come from? Zach's refusal to believe arises out of past hurt. Zechariah has a heart full of doubt that God is capable or even able because of bitterness over something that happened in the past. Zechariah thinks his bitter past trumps the promises and the power of a sovereign God. It was the custom in this day for the priest to stand on the porch after leaving the holy place and to give the people a blessing. And in verse 21, the people were waiting for Zechariah and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. Now, when a priest did not come out right away, their first thought would have been, he's judged. He's judged by God. He did something to dishonor God. He treated God's presence trivial. He tried to take a peek into the holiest of holies, and then poof, he's gone. So they were waiting. Finally, the door opens in verse 22, and when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs, and he remained mute. And let me give you 6 applications. Bring this home. Application number 1. There are many different things that can make you feel barren. Maybe you're in some hairy situations like that. Something you can't understand why God hasn't given it to you. God, why haven't you given me kids? Why am I not married? Why was I overlooked again for promotion? Why can't we ever round the corner financially? Why aren't my kids normal? Why do I have to deal with this debilitating disease? Why do I have to be a single parent? Why isn't my marriage pleasant like theirs? And maybe you, like Elizabeth, even feel the sting of what other people say about you. So what's wrong with him? Why isn't he married? I'll tell you why. He's not single for a season. He's single for a reason. The sting. Something must be off in that home if the kids are behaving that way. The sting. The point of this text is not to instruct you that God will always take away your barrenness. And I think that's how it's preached like 99.9% of the time. That is not the point of the text. The point of this text is not for you to think that God will give you whatever you're lacking so you will not feel barren anymore. In fact, in many ways, Zechariah never got the enjoyment out of the thing he hoped for. He was old when he had John. He died when John was just a boy. He was never able to see him graduate middle school, high school, have kids, meet his grandkids. Kids, promotion, healing, they are all only temporary fixes to your soul's barrenness. And your soul will always feel barren if you try to fill it with anything down here. The point is not that the birth of John the Baptist took away their soul's barrenness. No, there was another baby who was in the process of being born to somebody else who would do that. Jesus takes away the barrenness of the human soul. Here's application number 2. God hears a lot of prayers. God hears a lot of your prayers long before he answers them. God's delay doesn't mean he's rejected your request. Keep praying. Your prayers never die. Even if your faith in that prayer has died. Keep praying. Application number 3. Take note of God's view of the unborn. Now, I could pull this out in the next 4 weeks that I'm preaching through the book of Luke, but I decided to pull it out now. Take note of the view of the unborn. The first thought here is that conception is the act of God. God is involved in conception. I mean, we can turn to the Old Testament and find many passages that support this thought. I think the classic one is Ruth chapter 4:13, when it says that God gave Ruth conception. Conception is the act of God in this story. Bubbles that up to the surface. Secondly, this passage refers to the unborn in living human terms. The angel doesn't refer to the preborn John as it or thing. Gabriel refers to the preborn baby as he. John was not a mass of tissue. He's not an unliving thing. He was a briefos. That's the Greek word in Luke 1:41. It's used all throughout. The briefos. So when it talks about the baby in the womb of Elizabeth, it refers to it as a briefos. The same word appears in Luke chapter 2, verse 12, when it's talking about baby Jesus, when it says, there will be a sign for you. You will find a baby, briefos, wrapped in clothes, lying in a manger. In other words, briefos in the womb, briefos out of the womb, baby in the womb, baby out of the womb, human in the womb, human out of the womb. Thirdly, and I think the most startling of these 3 thoughts, is that the unborn can experience emotion. We discover later in chapter 1 that this baby, this briefos in the womb, leaped for joy when Elizabeth and Mary spoke to one another. I think this is probably the strongest evidence that you'll find in Scripture. Babies experience emotion in the womb. Look, we have talked ladies out of having abortion in this church. And here's why. Because we believe babies are made in the image of God. We've talked some of you out of having abortions. Why? It is because of this. The imago Dei, the image of God. Baby in the womb, baby out of the womb. Application number 4. Don't let your barrenness consume you. Or I could phrase it like this. Do not let your disappointment consume you. Some people just mark their lives by personal trials and tragedies. You say things like this. It's been 10 years since our child passed away. It's been 4 years to the day when we filed for bankruptcy. 5 years ago, we lost everything in the hurricane. This month, 3 years ago, we got the diagnosis from the doctor, and life changed after that. Now, I'm going to say something trite. I want to warn you, it's going to be trite. It's like something you find on a coffee cup. I'm going to say something trite, but I'm going to pack it with theology after. All right, so don't throw things at me when I give you this triteness, okay? Here's the trite statements. Our disappointments will either make us bitter or better. That's a perfect coffee cup statement, isn't it? Our disappointments will either make us bitter or better. Now, let me pack that with some theology. Our disappointments have a way of producing terrible theology and denials of God's goodness. Don't let your disappointments turn you into a bitter person who says, God is not good. Bitter people can't let things go. Bitter people aren't pleasant to be around. Bitter people refuse to swim in grace. We can be so focused on our problems that we can't hear God's promises, and we fail to believe God's power. Is that not what Zach was going through? Did you know that you could block out the sun? Massive sun. You could block out the massive sun with a quarter. All you have to do is bring the quarter right up to your eye. And we sometimes hold our problems so close to our eyes, bringing them so close we cannot see the great glowing sun of God's promises and God's power. And when our eyes are on our problems, we will not remember God's promises, and we will not remember how they apply to us. Next one. God isn't punishing you. He's perfecting you. I'm sure Zach and Elizabeth were asking themselves, what are we doing wrong? Why can't we get pregnant? God is punishing us. It's often what people say after a miscarriage. God is punishing me. Being a part of the redeemed doesn't exempt us from heartaches. That's what the prosperity gospel preaches, not the biblical gospel. Please, church, be more spiritually mature than to equate God's approval with our earthly blessings. You are not free from disappointment because you serve God. It's an old Puritan who said, God had one son without sin, but no sons without sorrow. Even if God has called you to a disappointment, and he has for some of you, even if God has called you to a disappointment, I want to tell you this. There's really no place like a disappointment for God to prove himself to you, that his power is perfected in your weakness. God is marring you to mend you. And we are just suckers. We're suckers for ease. God, don't give me the knife. I don't want the knife. And if the knife comes, I'm going to question if you're good. If the knife comes, I'm going to question if you're punishing me. We're suckers for ease. Churches are built on that, actually, because people are suckers for ease. Now, let me illustrate this way. Would I want someone sticking a knife into my chest? Well, it depends on what his intentions are. If he's trying to murder me, No. And I'll have to unleash this 120 pounds of steel on him. But if he's a doctor performing open heart surgery with the scalpel trying to save my life, then bring on the knife. Bring on the knife. And for believers in Jesus, God doesn't punish you for your sin. Now, if you're here and you're not a Christian, and some of you are not Christians, you're going to face the punishment for your sin. You're going to face the judgment for your sin unless you run to Christ in repentance. But let me just talk for a moment to believers, to those that are Christians. For believers in Jesus, God doesn't punish you for your sin. Like, oh man, I messed up this week. God's going to punish me. He doesn't do that because Jesus took every ounce of penalty for you. God doesn't punish you for your sin because God punished Jesus for your sin. And if God punished Jesus for your sin, he can't punish you because that would be, you would be taking two punishments for the same sin, and that would just be unjust, and God is just. So now, when God works on you, he does so without the slightest hint of retribution. He does it with the scalpel of healing and not the knife of judgment. Jesus got the knife of God's judgment so that you could get the scalpel of God's healing. And you may feel like God is paying me back. He's not. He paid Jesus back every ounce of retribution so that not a drop remains for you. And I could not help but to think, after reading this text this week, and just think, I cut out half the sermon and I still got another like 50 minutes on this one. I could not help but to think this. There's a meaning here beyond just that God can give children to people who think there's no hope. And then it led me here. There's a meaning in your struggle that is beyond what you can see. God's ways are beyond your comprehension. God's delays are beyond your understanding. And most often, I mean, is this not true? Can we not just as a group testify to this? Most often, we're never enlightened as to our suffering. We are only encouraged to trust and persevere and know that his grace will be enough. And it's always enough. The last application. God is at work in ways that aren't immediately apparent. That's the only thing some of you can hold on to with what you're facing right now. God is at work in ways that aren't immediately apparent. I never finished the story about Sevilla and David and their little infant girl. Within 8 months of them giving the baby up for adoption, or him giving the baby up for adoption, little Aina was alone again. For her adopted parents also died of malaria. And Aina was given to another missionary couple who was retiring from the field. They brought her home with them and raised her in the United States. Her name was changed to Aggie, and she grew up under the care of her adoptive parents in South Dakota. She eventually married a man, and they both entered the ministry. She knew very little of her past. She only knew that her parents' names. She only knew the fact that she was born in Africa, that her mother died of malaria shortly after childbirth, and that soon afterward her father gave her up for adoption. Now, she assumed that her father lived in Sweden, but she never met him. She continued with life, enjoying her growing family, fruitful ministry, supporting her husband, who actually became the president of a Bible college in Seattle, Washington. Then one day, a Swedish religious magazine appeared in her mailbox at home. She had no idea who sent it. She certainly couldn't read the language. It was a complete mystery. But as she stood there turning the pages, all of a sudden, a photograph arrested her attention. It was a jungle setting in Africa. The photograph focused on a grave with a simple white cross at the head of it. And carved into that little white cross was the name, Sevilla Flood. She rushed to the office of the college faculty member who could translate the magazine article, and he summarized it by telling her this. Well, it's about missionaries who came long ago. The birth of the baby, the death of a young mother, and one little African boy who had been led to Christ by the woman before she died. and how after the missionaries had left, the boy had grown up and persuaded the chief to let him build a school. And he won all of his students to Christ, and eventually their parents, and the chief also. Today, there were 600 believers in that village. For Aggie's 25th wedding anniversary, the Bible college gave her and her husband a vacation trip to Sweden, where, among other things, Aggie could finally search for her father. She discovered that he had been remarried years earlier. He had a family, 4 children, but that bitterness had slowly taken its toll, and he had recently suffered a stroke. After an emotional meeting with her half-brothers and sisters, Aggie brought up the subject of seeing her father. They replied, "You can talk to him, even though he's very ill. But you need to know that he's had one rule in our family since our birth. He's never allowed any of us to break it, and the rule is simply this: never, ever mention the name of God, because God is not good." She was undeterred. She eventually walked into his bedroom. Her father was now 73 years old, lying in a bed in a frail condition. He turned toward her and immediately began to weep as he said, "Ayana." He said, "I'm so sorry." "It's all right, Papa," she replied. "God took care of me." The old man instantly stiffened. Tears stopped. He said, God forgot about us. God forgot about us out there." He turned his face to the wall. "Papa, you didn't go to Africa in vain. Mama didn't die in vain. God was at work through you. That little boy that accepted Christ grew up to win the whole village to Jesus Christ. Today there are 600 African people serving the Lord because you followed the call of God on your life. Papa, God had a plan all along. He had not forgotten you." He turned back from facing the wall. They began to talk. Went into the afternoon, into the wee hours of the night, and eventually the kindness of God brought this man to repentance. He came back to Christ. A few weeks later, David Flood went home to be with the Lord. Seems like that was the end of the story. Until a few years later, Aggie and her husband were attending an evangelism conference in London, and a report was given from the nation of Zaire, which is the modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo. Then it was Zaire. And it was given by a superintendent of the national church representing 110 believers. He spoke eloquently about the spread of the gospel in his country. Afterwards, Aggie couldn't help but to go up and ask him if he'd ever heard of David and Svea Flood. He said, "Yes, madam. As a little boy, I used to sell them chicken and eggs twice a week. It was Svea Flood who led me to Christ." They embraced for a long time. He then said, "You must come and visit us. Your mother is the most famous person in our church history." And in time, Aggie did come, and she was welcomed by cheering masses of villagers. Eventually, she was taken to her mother's grave with a white cross and the words, "Svea Flood." She knelt in the soil to pray and give thanks to a God who was good and patient. The National Church reader read scripture over her as she was praying. "Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy." There will come a day when everyone's story will make sense. For most, it will not be on this side of eternity. But for a few, like them, and Zachariah and Elizabeth, answers come so that the grace of God can be magnified. I can just see old Zachariah after the week of service heading home, driving his mule way over the speed limit, people yelling, "Watch out, Zachariah, you're going to break a hip." Zachariah arrives to their humble little farmhouse. He rushes in the door. He finds his wife. He's trying to explain to her what happened with signs. She thinks he's playing charades. He motions 2 syllables. First letter B. He tries the mouth. It rhymes with maybe. She doesn't get it. She hates charades. Zacharias gets a piece of parchment. He looks for quill and he writes these words. We have 50 years of tears. We clung to the belief that God was good even when it didn't feel like it. Elizabeth, God sent an angel to me this week. You're going to have a baby. She leans back in her kitchen chair and smiles. Then she jumps up and down, starts yelling. Verse 25, the Lord has looked on me to take away my reproach among the people. He continues writing, just think, Elizabeth, we're not going to have just any baby boy. Our son will be the one to introduce the Son of God, the Lamb of God, who comes to take away the sins of the world. And that gospel, that good news, will not be delivered to one village alone. Our little boy will introduce the gospel to our nation, and it will eventually travel around the world to all villages. Elizabeth, our story makes sense now because it's part of God's story. Elizabeth, my job makes sense now. Our disappointment makes sense now. Everything makes sense when we see our story as part of a greater story. And he ended with these words, Elizabeth, our disappointment was part of God's divine appointment.